man acts in a cynical way, reacting to external demands or instruction rather than in ways determined by his own interests and energies and power. He says we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is. For Humboldt, then, man is born to inquire and create. And when a man or a child chooses to inquire or create out of his own free choice, then he becomes in his own terms an artist rather than a tool of production or a well-trained parent.
Hello, and welcome to Diet Soap number 24, entitled Revolution Brings Sunlight. I'm Douglas Lane, the editor of the zine Diet Soap, and the host of this podcast. This episode is going out on Wednesday, September 23rd, 2009, and it features an interview with an anarchist writer whose work includes journalism, fiction, and critical biography. Len Bracken is the author of the first widely distributed book published in the United States, suggesting that the 9/11 attacks were an inside job, and that book is entitled Shadow Government, 9/11 and State Terror. And he is the author of the first biography of Guy Debord in any language, entitled simply Guy Debord Revolutionary. If you're a regular listener to the Diet Soap podcast, then you are probably familiar with the figure of Guy Debord, and also with the Situationist International. Or, if you're not familiar with him, at least you've heard me discuss Debord and his revolutionary anti-art group in previous episodes. What you've never heard on the Diet Soap podcast is any explanation of who Guy Debord was and what the SI, or Situationist International, was about. So, before I begin the interview with Len Bracken, let me offer an explanation of the SI from Ken Knabb's Situationist Anthology. Ken writes, in 1957, a few European avant-garde groups came together to form the Situationist International. Over the next decade, the SI developed an increasingly incisive and coherent critique of modern society and of its bureaucratic pseudo-opposition, and its new methods of agitation were influential in leading up to the May 1968 revolt in France. Since then, although the SI itself was dissolved in 1972, situationist theses and tactics have been taken up by radical currents in dozens of countries all over the world. I'll just add that Guy Debord was a central figure behind the SI, is perhaps the most important book of political philosophy of the second half of the 20th century, if not the entire 20th century. So if it seems to you that I talk about Debord and the Situationists a lot, this is because I happen to believe that their ideas, while not fully developed or final, are especially significant in these days of the new normal. So with that out of the way, let's listen to my conversation with Len Bracken. Len Bracken, you are the author of one of the first widely distributed books published in the U.S., suggesting that the 9/11 attacks were an inside job. You are an active member of the National Press Club and a member in good standing of the Baltimore-Washington Newspaper Guild. You frequently contribute to Paranoia magazine and recently turned in an article there called The Invisible Currency of Fascism. You were born at the Andrews Air Force Base in Camp Springs, Maryland. And let's see, you're the first major writer of a biography on Guy Debord in English, and possibly in any language. You're a novelist with several books, one of which would be Snitch Jacket, and just all around a versatile writer of all types of work. Are there things that I left out that you want to mention?
Well, I guess from the the perspective of you being a sort of a zine publisher, it might be interesting for your listeners to know that I was the editor of a zine as well. I edited a zine called Extra File back in the 90s, and that's how I was sort of encouraged to write this biography on Guy Debord, which was in fact the first in any language. And also I was a member of the Wobblies and a member of an anarchist collective up in Baltimore, and which was part of the Northeastern Federation of Anarcho-Communists. And I was really a very much of an activist up until 9/11. And after 9/11, when I really think that we had a lot of the powers that be on the ropes, I think that we could see just how powerful they were, and they were able to pull this off and lie about it and get away with it. It really makes it very difficult to oppose these powers, because they have this ability to sort of impose their vision of the world.
Well, it certainly has been different since 9/11 in this country, and we will discuss that in your book, The Shadow Government of 9/11 and State Terror. But I wanted to start with I'm one of the things that made me really interested to talk to you even after I wrote to you was that you were working on an essay or a report about this economic crisis. But I'd be interested to know just kind of what your take is on this new 9/11 and the economic collapse that's come out of it.
Right. Well, I think that they are similar in the sense that they are being billed as failures when in fact they can actually be looked at as successes. And with 9/11, it was the intelligence services and the state security apparatus that supposedly failed so miserably when in fact it pulled off this inside job. And I would say that the financial elite, the banksters, have succeeded in running up such amazing amounts of leverage. They've succeeded in keeping the over-the-counter derivatives trade outside of state regulation, federal regulation, and in doing so, they were able to create really their own form of money in these credit default swaps, which are a huge, probably American banks may be on the hook for something like $100 trillion worth of these credit default swaps. But that even pales comparison to the overall derivatives market, which includes interest rate derivatives and foreign exchange derivatives, which on a global scale is over $1 quadrillion worth of notional value there.
So there's $1 quadrillion worth of debt out there because of all these phony financial products?
Yeah, well, I guess, some of them are legitimate hedges, and so there is probably some place for some of it, but it's just gotten way out of control, and a lot of it is done for pure speculation. And what's really kind of criminal about all this is that the speculators are being bailed out at par, so for a full dollar for dollar, and they're not taking any haircut. AIG is a great example. They wrote all these credit default swaps on anything. It could be, say, for example, the default of General Motors, which just happened yesterday. They went into bankruptcy. And so, they're going to pay out people that had no shares in General Motors or any stake in that particular, in that enterprise, just betting on the default. And evidently, Ben Bernanke was very upset when he found out that AIG was writing all these, all of these agreements, these contracts, because essentially it is a way of kind of creating money, and in the end, it's been the Federal Reserve and that's had to bail them out, to the tune of almost $200 billion so far. And we can look at a lot of this financial shenanigans involve people that were involved with intelligence communities. So there is a real link there, not just in the fact that they had these purported failures which were indeed successes, but they are linked in terms of the actual people. I don't want to go and say any names because I don't want to be sued for libel, but I will say that Enron, for example, was basically run by people who were current and former CIA, and so that was the biggest campaign contributor to the Bush administration, and one of the the reasons for the invasion of Afghanistan. To get back to the question of if I could just answer it in this way, and this is one of the things, is that everyone says that, for example, the United States is becoming a socialist country because they're nationalizing these companies, when in fact I used to live in the Soviet Union, and I can tell you that there is no equivalent in the Soviet Union to our banking elite. I mean, it just doesn't even compare in terms of the wealth and the privilege and the luxury goods and the vacations and the private planes and everything like that. I mean, it wasn't there. So, I mean, really, the more apt comparison would be with Mussolini's Italy, in which all the people that backed him were bailed out during the Great Depression.
Well, it seems to me that what's happening is the exact opposite of socialism. It's the privatization of our economy at one more level. It's where basically private financiers are grabbing the national treasury. I mean, it's what it looks like to me. It's that these people are now taking complete control over the way the state spends its money. Is that, you think, correct?
Oh, I think it's a complete kleptocracy. They're basically looting the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And I was a beat reporter covering the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. In fact, the rate cuts that were announced September, October, and December of 2007 went out on my voice. I did the countdown in the Treasury press room, which shares the press office with the Federal Reserve. So I was right there and covering Bernanke and covering Paulson. I can tell you that they're very worried about people sort of finding out what is really taking place here. And what has really happened is that not only have they given them, untold, vast sums of money. Basically, they're saying at this point it's 12.8 trillion has been extended to them and to the banksters in one form or another. But they're in exchange they're taking all of the toxic assets onto the Federal Reserve's books as collateral, and so it's almost twice as bad. From what I read, the banks need to be nationalized and then sort of sell off the bad assets and reconstituted. For the purposes of my article for Paranoia, I talked to Nicholas Nassim Taleb, the author of The Black Swan and professor of risk at NYU, and he's arguing in favor of nationalization and turning the banks essentially into utilities that provide credit and loans and more or less the equivalent of the way banks operated back in the Soviet Union. No more of these gold-plated helicopters to fly around in.
Well, see, it just strikes me that kind of approach to the banking crisis shouldn't be relegated to Paranoia magazine. That should be like at least seriously debated in the mainstream, if not actively pursued. I mean, I think that's perfectly reasonable to be pursued. The fact that they're not pursuing that kind of reasonable approach, what strikes me as a reasonable approach, is that simply out of personal greed? Is that just simply to protect each person's interests or this class interest in the short term? Or is there a kind of a more strategic approach going on here? Is there a long-term strategy, social political strategy? Are we moving towards something?
No, it looks like it's really ad hoc. They're protecting, if not themselves personally, their friends. Geithner is just essentially a bureaucrat. He was sort of mentored by all these titans of the financial industry, and Paulson, of course, was one of them. And they're going to protect their friends. They're going to protect their industry. Basically, it's class. They're going to protect their class of financial capital, and all of those interests that are sort of surrounding that class. So, and they're on the ropes to a certain degree. I mean, but you have to figure that the ones that are getting laid off are not going to be the kingpins, and they're all walking away with these great golden parachutes as well.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Situationists. You wrote the first book on Guy Debord, the first biography, and I guess I want to introduce this subject is to ask you, kind of still on this economic crisis, does this represent a opportunity for people like you and me who want to see a better world? Does this represent an opportunity for some more substantial change? And I guess also, are people who are in power and making these moves aware of the way that their crisis, their manufactured crisis, might create opportunities for social transformation?
Right. I guess what I would say, first off, is that we can't underestimate them, and we don't know how far they'll go. And if you were to look at, there's all these various theories of imperialism, and of course, in the end, imperialism does indeed break down because, for example, you have these far-flung empires, and it costs too much to maintain and whatnot. And we may, in fact, be experiencing some of that. And some of this financial crisis may, also have this military and imperial component to it. We can't ignore that. But you just never know how far that can go. Once these people have power, it's very hard to unseat them. I was looking back at some of Debord's writing before the interview, and they had this expression of the Gros Marcus that kind of mistranslated it. They called it cette cohérence réversible du monde, this reversible coherence of the world. So the idea for the situation is you have this kind of unity, this totality of the world as it exists, and you want to reverse that. But when you see just how much power has been amassed and just what the consequences are for trying to really fight against it, I would say that chances are fairly slim, but I wouldn't rule it out. But I would say that we know that they're producing these camps all around the country, and they have plans for civilian labor from run by the military. That there could be really supreme sanctions for anyone who tries to seriously fight against the powers that be, especially as things worsen. That's when they would be most likely to to ratchet up their police powers. We may find ourselves in a situation in Sun Tzu called total war, where any effort to fight against the opponent would be met with the swiftest reprisals.
But we did see a change in the last election in the United States, where the bad cop was replaced with the good cop. And that seems to me to show it to be, from a kind of an oppositional point of view, the Obama's election would strike me to be an admission from the people who in power that the direct confrontation and total war is not perceived to be an option right now, and that the human face has to go back on to the power structure, and that also would seem to me to represent an opportunity for people who want more substantial social change, because the system is making the promise of a better, kinder nation and making it in a way that a lot of people believe. Do you see there's an opportunity there in this kind of a new context?
Yeah, I think that people want change, but of course I just don't think Obama is going to give it, and I think it's more the same. I mean, there's so many things that they haven't done that they could have done, going after Bush and Cheney for war crimes, new 9/11 commission, and the new 9/11 investigation. They're even dragging their heels on going back to releasing these documents pertaining to the October surprise when the Reagan administration and William Casey and H.W. Bush did this arms for no hostages deal in order to prevent Jimmy Carter from getting a second term. I mean, all of this could come out if and this is one of the things that people tend to forget about revolutions, is that when revolutions take place, a lot of the conspiracies by the elites are revealed. But this is the thing that when they had the Russian Revolution, the whole Sykes-Picot Accord was released, because this is the deal to sort of divide up the Middle East, or when they had the revolution in Portugal in the mid-'70s, it was revealed that fascist regime of Salazar was a place where they had staged a lot of this black orchestra, the revival of the Nazis and the sort of militarization of terrorist cells, fake terrorist cells posing as lefties, the Red Brigades and others. And all of these things came out when you have your your revolutions. But until then, this charade is maintained, and they can sort of create this false boogeymans, you're Osama bin Laden, and then fearmonger and basically corral the population in any way they want. And I'm afraid that the American population, there's no revolutionary tradition here, and it'd be sort of unlikely. I will say this, if I can finish though, is that a revolution essentially is a civil war, and I wrote a general theory of civil war. It's kind of a funny thing. I wrote it for as a master's thesis for someone for pay, and then I changed it and published it myself. But what I think is that the only hope that we have, I think, is if we really can go against this merchandise economy, and when we talk about the spectacle, it is always the spectacle merchandise or the spectacle commodity, preferably say the spectacle merchandise economy, and so this is the image and the product. And we can maybe move off into other realms where we just have products for that have pure use value, and they don't have this exchange value associated with them, and a war against work. So and this is and things could actually, the current situation could conceivably move in that direction. So because if enough jobs are eliminated and people find themselves without work, then they can have this perhaps a revolutionary use of time. They can enter into the historical moment and become part of history. And basically, you see, when you talk about history now, and this is what you really learn from the Situationists, and their sense of historicity, is that the great historical moment that we're living now is that everybody gets up in the morning, goes to work, and buys their merchandise and comes home and does it day after day after day. This is the historical event. All the little wars and big wars and other things that happen, those are of less significance than to this basic reproduction of daily life in that event. And if that could be disrupted, if that could be reversed through not working and through or far less work, and through another form of production and consumption outside of exchange value, then there is a room for revolution.
I'm so tired, I haven't slept a wink. I'm so tired, my mind is on the blink. I wonder, should I get up and fix myself a drink? No, 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 I'm so tired, I don't know what to do. I'm so tired, my mind is set on you. I wonder, should I call you? But I know what you would do. You'd say, I'm putting you on, but it's no joke. It's doing me harm, you know I can't sleep. I cast on my brain, you know it's 3 weeks. I'm going insane, you know I'd give you everything I've got for a little peace of mind. I'm so tired, I'm feeling so upset. Although I'm so tired, I'll have another cigarette and curse Sir Walter Raleigh. He was such a stupid git. You'd say, I'm putting you on, but it's no joke. It's doing me harm, you know I can't sleep. I cast up my brain, you know it's 3 weeks. I'm going insane, you know I'd give you everything I got for a little peace of mind. I'd give you everything I got for a little peace of mind. Give you everything I got for a little peace of mind.
In your book on Guy Debord, you quote Marx in the final paragraph. This is something I wrote down to bring up to you, so I'm going to do that. You write that a situation is created, this is a quote, a situation is created from which retreat is impossible, and circumstances themselves cry, hic Rhodus, hic salta. I may not have pronounced that right, but Guy Debord translated that last line as saying, here is the wall, here is the mason. But looking it up, I find the Latin can be translated as, here is Rhodes, here is where you should jump. It comes from Aesop's fable, The Braggart, and it means essentially put up or shut up, or more optimistically, that the time and the place to take the leap is here and now. So why did you choose to close your book with that sentiment, and do you feel like those words are still appropriate today?
Yeah, I guess that when I wrote the book, I was in much more of an activist phase than I am now. I would say that I was much more hopeful because this whole anti-globalization thing was underway. I mean, it seemed, at least up until 9/11, everywhere these guys went, everywhere these big global power elites went, they were getting pies in their face. They were getting, the tear gas canisters were being put at the air inducts of their conference halls, and they were coming out crying. When 9/11 happened, I was in Riga, Latvia, part of this big untitled exhibition where we had Adbusters posters all across the country, all across the city. They had big billboards with these cowboys talking about cancer in Latvian language, and they had a tram that went around the entire city. And we had taken out all the seats, and people were coming in, and we were giving talks about the problems of consumerism. This is around 2001. Just think about that, and think about where Latvia is now. It's in complete shambles. And but the point I was going to make is that right when that happened, The Economist magazine had the reputation of Naomi Klein. Instead of saying no logo, they had pro logo, and they used the exact same colors that she had on her book. They were kind of mimicking her and saying that, arguing in favor of this consumer culture. the fact that the Economist would have to respond to Naomi Klein on the cover of their weekly publication just shows you how much this kind of consumer economy was on the ropes. And then 9/11 happens, and that just took the wind out of everybody's sail, because those of us who knew that, okay, if they can do this, they can do anything.
Right. But on the other hand, now the consumer economy is materially on the ropes. People aren't participating in it at the same level because they simply can't. We have to think about judo here. Yeah, the strength of your enemy can be turned against your enemy.
Well, I mean, and let's put it this way: if there's a revolutionary situation arises, then I'll put my revolutionary hat back on. Until then, we tried everything. We tried to unionize, with Wobblies and create radical unions. And there was a little bit of success at Baltimore Airport. We tried these affinity groups. We tried to have this federation of anarchist collectives all up and down the East Coast, from Richmond to Quebec. And we just keep trying and trying. A lot of effort, so many meetings, so many things. And then have all of that sort of wiped out in one fell swoop, where everybody's running for cover. No one is thinking. And you see, even if we would get back to that same situation, what's to say they won't pull out something else? I mean, they could have holograms, make it look like aliens are landing or something.
Yeah, you and Neil Kramer should talk. The guy I had on recently, he's actually up on the podcast right now. Talks about Project Bluebeam, which is that theory that they're going to try to control the population through staging a UFO landing. I tell you, if that particular conspiracy comes off, I will not be able not to enjoy that. That would be living inside of a science fiction movie. That would be exciting, even if it was totally phony and I knew it. It would just, I can't imagine that really playing out. So that would be, I can't help but think that would be fun. But yeah, I definitely see what you're saying about kind of running up against the limit every time you make an attempt. I wonder if the real culprit, though, is it the secret machinations of government and power elites and things like 9/11, or is it something in our own psychology? I mean, if we weren't susceptible to their tricks, then something like 9/11 wouldn't work. I mean, rationally and logically, the attacks of 9/11 did not mean that the problems of globalization went away. And there was not a rational response to throw the growing concerns about the environment and about economic justice aside at that moment. But somehow we were manipulated. And, you kind of got to turn around and look at yourself. And that includes, I think, the left. Because I was involved in some peace groups right after 9/11. In fact, I wrote to you. I emailed you around that time. I don't think you may not remember that, but I was just reaching out to anybody who I knew of who had a radical perspective, and I had read your book. And I emailed you, and I said, I'd really like to be involved with a legitimate peace movement, but it just doesn't seem like there's any groups forming that are legitimate. And that was right before I actually did get involved with a group called PPRC. And what I found was that the problem was reproduced every day in these meetings, that the kind of mentality of the spectacle was recreated and reproduced in these activist groups. And I don't even think it required outside involvement or manipulation. I think that the real legitimate people were coming into these groups and creating the same power structure and interiorized limitations to what they could do on their own initiative. So, maybe somebody like Neil Kramer or maybe aliens landing will be what it will take to kind of jostle us out of whatever mental condition or false consciousness we have. Anyway, I've been talking way too much.
No. Hopefully I responded to your email. Did I write you back?
You did respond.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and we had an exchange back and forth a few times, and what you said at the time was that regardless of the fact that the coming attacks on Afghanistan were going to be horrible for the people of Afghanistan, and regardless of the fact that you were opposed to the war on terror, that you felt it was most important to continue with your anti-globalization work and your work with the IWW, and that you were not going to be distracted, that you were going to continue to press for working class issues, and basically not issues, but working class empowerment, even in the face of 9/11, which makes sense. But
yeah. I guess what happened was that we tried to keep the wall. I moved from Maryland into D.C. right around that time, and I was still going up to Baltimore quite a bit. But then I ended up being more centered here in D.C. and we couldn't really keep the WOBs together. And then things just seemed to get worse and worse. The institution of this Department of Homeland Security, the NSA spying, and when I wrote my book, these kind of warnings from people and finding my apartment open. At this point, I'm just trying to figure out what's really going on, because I think that there's so much that's happening behind the scenes, and to try to put just that much effort into organizing, and DC is not the most conducive place for that. Let's put it that way. And of course, I've run into some other journalists. I don't know. Did you ever read Wayne Madsen? Are you familiar with him at all?
I am. I know him. You sent me an article by him, and I've heard of him before.
Right. So I spent a lot of time with him. So of course, we know everything that they're capable of from a lot of these leaks that he gets. My life is pretty tough here in Washington. I've been spit upon in Georgetown. I've been asked to leave restaurants because the Georgetown Business Association doesn't approve of me. I showed my movie, The Lazy Ones, in Georgetown, and it was kind of scandalous. When I was covering the Treasury Department, I was denied a security clearance. Everybody else gets one, the low-level security pass. They had a big meeting, and Cheney was there, and there's only about 10 of us reporters in this one little pen, and Cheney just snarled right at me, and I looked at him, and he looked down, and he snarled at me again, and then later I heard one of these Treasury Department press women say that, that guy must really be something if the vice president is upset that he's there. So I really feel, in a lot of ways, that I kind of have to watch my back a little. I'm pretty radioactive here in D.C. Women that break up with me because it sinks in what my books are about, either the nonfiction or because of that they might work for the government, or the the fiction because it's too erotic, and they don't. Some women wouldn't want their fathers to know that they're dating a man who would write those kind of books.
Well, power to you, and in a way, it's a badge of honor to have Richard Cheney sneer at you. That's like I would almost feel like I'd been handed an award at that moment. But on the other hand, you have to live with the isolation that brings on, the being kind of radioactive there in D.C. Yeah, keep going, keep fighting the good fight there. And I'm not saying that it's going to be easy or that I have a lot of optimism. I just feel like it's important to hold on to some optimism right now. And Slavoj Žižek recently said that he thought the economic crisis did present an opportunity to the left and to Marxists and people who were utopian in their thinking. And I don't know how much respect I have for Slavoj Žižek, but he's certainly interesting to listen to. And
a friend of mine just went to the big conference that he hosted in London. I guess he's kind of this caviar left. It's easy for him to say. He's a professor in London, with an ex-model girlfriend. Everything is, going fine for him, He can just disagree with everything in a sort of mild way, and nobody gets particularly upset, and he's just, mildly contentious, and so I don't really see him at the barricades. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's true. But I can see him on YouTube, so sometimes I watch that.
I like Zinn. I like his work as a historian. Chomsky kind of leaves me pretty cold, although I have to say that sometimes he's very well spoken, and particularly about U.S. foreign policy. He can sort of unpack the files and read the files to you of everything that's gone wrong for the last 75 years. Go back to things like 9/11, like October Surprise, like these major crimes for people that, of course, I guess Chomsky is a wob, and you're going to say, okay, if people are perpetrating these major crimes and we have enough evidence, how can you say, oh, it's un-American, or, I don't want to put words in Chomsky or Zinn's mouth, but I do think that when you get things like, for example, the first World Trade Center bombing, it was printed in the Wall Street Journal and in the New York Times that the FBI had an infiltrator in there, and he had showed them how to make the bombs, where to park the cars. He was taken off the case. He could have prevented it. He had his FBI handlers in quotes on tape saying that, and yet people are going to say, "Oh, that's conspiracies." And you look at Machiavelli. Machiavelli in Chapter 6 of the Discourses, he lists all the various types of conspiracies. And these history professors, political science professors say that if Machiavelli were in my class, I would give him a B- or something like that. Well, that just goes to show the kind of thinking that goes on. It's anything that reeks of conspiracy must by definition be false. And so, I just think that the only way that we could really ever get any kind of enough outrage to provoke any kind of revolt would be if people were aware of these horrendous crimes.
Four and 20 years ago, I come into this life, the son of a woman and a man who lived in strife. He was tired of being poor, and he wasn't into selling door to door, and he worked like the devil to be more. Different kind of poverty now upsets me so. Night after sleepless night, I walk the floor and I want to know, why am I so alone? Where is my woman? Can I bring her home? Have I driven her away? Is she gone? Comes the sunrise and I'm driven to my bed. I see that it is empty and there's devils in my head. I embrace the many-colored beast. I grow weary of the torment. Can there be no peace? And I find myself just wishing that my life would simply cease.
I wonder if you're familiar with the Diet Soap podcast.
No, I'm not. Tell me about it.
Well, it is a podcast which was in part inspired by the Sea-Realm podcast. And the host, Doug Lane, he says that he thinks of his podcast as part of an ongoing conversation that takes place in a public space between the various podcasters. And he frequently puts together montages from different podcasts to sort of show how there are certain themes that are circulating through all of them, even though, we're not necessarily doing it deliberately or consciously.
Well, that's really fascinating. What's it called again?
Diet Soap.
Hi. It's been a while since I've talked directly to you. Been busy, as I've pointed out. Also been a little depressed, a little under the emotional weather.
In my mind, I feel like if I actually made some money and I didn't have to live like a dumbass, then, I wouldn't worry about it.
So you believe that?
Yeah.
So what are you doing at Sweater then?
I don't know.
Because, we know what we're doing at Sweater is deconstructing all that stuff. So it doesn't matter if you're a shit-ass, butt-fuck white trash cutting his hair with a vacuum cleaner, or if you're David fucking Bowie, you're still going to have that identity deconstructed and realize that it's a sham.
And he asked this other character about the next leader and coming into the White House, and he says, what do you mean by a con man? And the other character answers, just what it sounds like, a confidence man, someone who has the oratory ability to persuade the great mass of people to keep going to their jobs every day, someone who can restore the people's confidence in the consumer society, the so-called American way of life. That's the kind of person they'll push on us after Bush.
I'm pissed off as usual. First was amusing to me, but now it's become just absolutely sickening, and I'm just completely out of my mind with it. I can't even watch it anymore. On the one hand, you have liberals who continually convince themselves that Barack Obama's on their side, no matter what he does, no matter who he sells out to.
Do you think that there's people out there who've got a more, proficiently and aesthetically pleasingly constructed identity to convince themselves that they are happy with how they are? Do you think that they really are?
Well, I can't speak for them. I don't know. I would think that David Bowie would be pretty fucking pleased with himself, honestly.
So what about Gnosis then? I mean, where does that come into it? Because why would you need Gnosis if you'd managed to construct an identity that was pleasing enough to last you to death?
There's nothing like the fury of people who are disappointed and feel cheated.
Yeah, even in Iowa City, I'm seeing more and more cars where the Obama sticker is being steadily scraped off. They can't quite get the entire thing off.
Really?
And so it's very difficult, you see, to get down to what are your basic assumptions. What do you mean by the good life? What do you mean by consistency? What do you mean by rationality?
I mean, aren't you maddened? Aren't you frustrated by it? Hello? Aren't you crazed by this shit? I mean, do you talk about it with your neighbors? Probably not. Nobody else talks about it. I mean, I try in this so-called liberal town, Ann Arbor. I've tried with numerous people to talk about it. And, you know, for all of Ann Arbor's sophistication and supposed liberalism, people really don't want to talk about this shit. And the way I look at it, if I'm going to be living in this zoo of hallucination called the U.S., I want to get the best possible picture. So I'm hoping to save up by Thanksgiving for a plasma large screen HD TV, man. Maybe I can actually see my own anguish in HD. That would be the ultimate trip.
That was this week's podcast conversation, the segment where I cut up the podcast I've listened to over the week, rearrange them, and then set them to music. This week's podcast included Aeolus Cephas's Warty Theorems, KMO's C-Realm, the podcast Electric Politics with George Kinney, and the ranting of Diet Soap's own Dennis Perrin on YouTube. The music this week came from Chris Isto White, who sang the Lennon McCarthy song I'm So Tired, and the Crosby, Stills, and Nash hit 4 and 20. The music also came from a Nintendo game called Animal Crossing, which my 7 and soon-to-be 13-year-old sons enjoy quite a lot, and which seemed appropriately trippy and apocalyptic. You are, in fact, listening to video game music right now. If you've enjoyed this show and want to make a donation to my effort to produce pleasing podcasts each week, go to dietsoap.podomatic.com or write to me at douglane@dietsoap.org for an address you can send a check to. You can also find out more about the podcast and the zine Diet Soap at dietsoap.org. Or you can visit my website, which is douglaslane.com. Lane is spelled L-A-I-N. Please do take a look and at both websites and write to me. I long for emails. I also want to point out that nobody has taken the time to answer that Guy Debord riddle. We had a contest, and the riddle was the title of Debord's 1978 film entitled We Circle in the Night and Are Consumed by Fire. So, if you can tell me who we are who are consumed by fire, you will win a copy of Diet Soap, the zine. So really, if you think you know the answer, take a moment and send it my way. Why not? Anyhow, the contest will end next week.
Offer valid in the United States, Canada, and the territory of Puerto Rico only. Offer void where prohibited or restricted by law. Offer valid for purchases made from September 24, 2007 through October 31st, 2008. All rebate claims must be postmarked no later than 6 weeks from the date of purchase of Photoshop Element 6 software. Consumers who purchase the software from any one of the following retail establishments are not eligible for a rebate. Best Buy, BestBuy.com, BJ's, Sam's Club, Costco, Wholesale, OfficeMax, and Walmart. Submissions that include receipts from any one of the above retail establishments will be rejected. The rebate is paid in U.S. or Canadian currency only. The rebate claim form must be filled out completely and incorrectly. The company better proof of purchase document 1.
So that just about wraps up this week's episode. But before I can run the closing music, I have to turn the microphone over to my wife Miriam for this week's Titanic Factoid.
Our 12-year-old son thought that I ought to do a factoid about how the Titanic was made, which is a pretty big subject, but here it goes. So, the Titanic was built at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, and work began on it March 31st, 1909. The hull of the Titanic was made of overlapping steel plates, which were 1 inch thick and which were fastened by over 3 million rivets. And the rivets were 1 inch thick and 3 inches long, and they were also made of iron. The rivets were applied by a worker which was called the heater boy, who would heat the rivet until it was red hot, and then he would toss it to the catch boy, who put it in a wooden bowl, who caught it in a wooden bowl, and then used a pair of tongs, and then while the holder-up held a mallet over the rivet head on the outside of the hull, the basher on the inside of the hull would bash the rivet end into place. So they did that mostly by hand. And the hull was built with a double bottom, and this was a safety feature, as was the 16 watertight compartments. And you may remember that the ship could stay afloat with any 2 of the middle compartments or 4 of the first compartments flooded. And this is part of the reason that it was considered unsinkable, was that you could flood so much of it without this posing a problem. No one thought that so many compartments would end up full. So that is how the Titanic was made.